Tilburg University and Mind Labs present TAISIG Talks, the podcast that keeps you updated on the latest developments in the field of artificial intelligence in just 1 hour.
Hello, welcome to this edition of the TAISIG Talks. My name is Pieter Spronck. I'm a professor of computer science at Tilburg University. I will be chairing this talk, and I'm also the chair of TAISIG. TAISIG is the Tilburg Artificial Intelligence Special Interest Group. And the goal of the TAISIG Talks is to show what happens at Tilburg University in the area of artificial intelligence. This is meant for people within the university, but also for people in the world outside the university. Very often these talks tend to have a technical nature, and that's logical. AI is a technical topic, but also other aspects of AI, and we have also other talks in this area. And today, actually, we have a talk that is a quite new perspective. It is on how media influence technological developments, and since currently, a lot of technological developments are in the area of artificial intelligence. This seemed to me a very topical thing to bring up here in these TAISIG Talks. And I have a specialist here who can introduce us to this topic and tell us more about it. So that is Roos Slegers. Roos, welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, sure. So my name is Roos Slegers. Like you said, I'm a assistant professor of philosophy in the philosophy department here at Tilburg University. And one of my areas of interests, and what I do a lot of research on right now, is kind of the relationship between what is often called speculative literature. That's kind of the fancy term to talk about science fiction and fantasy. The influence of that kind of literature on our attitudes towards technological developments, and also how they might influence the actual developments themselves.
Okay, yeah, but okay, I understand that something like science fiction tends to be popular, at least in the movies. I don't know if it's that popular in literature. So why would this influence technological developments?
Right. Yeah. So the way I actually got into it was through pop culture, and of a very particular sort that's often not taken seriously by academics. Like, for example, the Terminator movies. Right. So even if you haven't seen the Terminator movies, you've probably heard of, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I've seen them, yeah.
You've seen them,
at
yes.
At least the first three, and after
right.
the third one was I stopped with
yeah.
that.
Let's not talk about what happened after the first three. But so these are movies that a lot of people know, few people take seriously. Right? Come on, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger in his bodybuilder days, pretending to be a machine from the future that comes to wreak havoc on humanity. But you actually see a lot of uptakes today, a lot of references to it, like whether people consciously reference it or it's sort of in their popular subconscious, right? Like this fear of the machines, this sort of future vision that's very dystopian where things are going to go horribly wrong. Back to your question, I started thinking about, on the one hand, these kind of movies, these things in pop culture, they are part of our popular subconscious, but also these movies were watched by people who right now are very influential and who also read, the sort of books that were the precursors to these movies. So I'm thinking here about what's often referred to as the hard sci-fi genre, mid-20th century. So Isaac Asimov, for example, but a little bit later also the works of Frank Herbert, Dune. And then if you look at Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Sundar Pichai, right, the Google CEO, all of them were heavily influenced by these works of science fiction. So to your question, how does this, is there an influence here? Of course, it's really hard to trace exactly empirically, but I don't think it's a surprise that Elon Musk wants to colonize Mars, right? And was a big fan of Dune, a novel in which foreign planets are colonized in order to, mine them for precious resources, etc. So on the one hand, there's this very fantastical view of the universe. On the other hand, there's these very real people who are, enacting, you might say, some of these science fiction narratives.
Okay, so I actually, when I was younger, I read a lot of science fiction. I occasionally read it today, but not that much anymore. But I know these works, and while they would influence my idea, so you get inspiration out of them, you also have a realistic feeling about it. So you understand that when you read, so much of the science fiction has certain assumptions. And so you want to travel to different planets. You have to assume that there is something like a faster than light drive. Even though we know that, according to physics, that is impossible. But you just pose that. So now you have posed that at the start of the book. That's fine. So now you can build upon that, and then you can start to speculate. But if you say Elon Musk has his idea of going to Mars, that assumes a lot of technological background, which isn't realistic. So, and I assume that someone like Elon Musk knows that. So why would this still influence his, let's say, his goals or the way he is setting up the future of his companies?
Right. So of course, speculating about Elon Musk is a favorite pastime, I think, of many reporters right now, since he's so incredibly powerful and will be more powerful under the new Trump administration. I think part of the disturbing but really interesting situation right now is that he is, in fact, despite the kind of technological obstacles, putting into practice some of the things that he is read in these books. Like, for example, of course, he has many companies, one of them Neuralink, where he's, placing these electrodes and these very these objects in people's brains, right? To make sure that their brains, or at least this is what he claims, can interface with computers. So this first guy, I forget his name now, who they tried this brain implant on. I think the first thing he did was play a video game for like 7 hours straight after he got the brain implant. So a paraplegic who, suddenly had the ability to control a computer. So here we have, something straight from the movies, right? Or straight from the sci-fi literature. That, is it working the way it does in those books? No, absolutely not. But clearly there's a goal here, right? That by Musk's own confession was inspired by Neuromancer, by these other stories where you have a brain-computer interface. Perhaps more realistically, or something that more of us interact with, is, of course, ChatGPT. And the famous recent story, which a lot of people will be aware of, is that Sam Altman, right, CEO of OpenAI, on the day that they demoed the new GPT-4, he tweeted one word, or he put one word on X, her, lower caps, right? A clear reference to the movie Her, from about 10 years ago, in which, of course, a person falls in love with his operating system. And so this wasn't subtext, right? It was just clearly, explicitly stated what we have here now. And he wrote about it on his own, Sam Altman did, on his own blog. Something that feels like the movies and that has now become a reality. So if you say, well, of course, when we talk about space travel, I'd say things are a little further off. But we see people now falling in love with their operating systems.
But I'm not surprised about that.
Right. So I guess the boundary between sort of what's possible, the boundary between science fiction and science fact, it at the very least appears to be becoming more blurry, where you might say, well, if this became a reality, then why not this other thing that also some years ago seemed completely out there?
Yeah, well, I could have arguments against that, because people falling in love with ChatGPT is no surprise to me.
No,
people fall in love with stuffed animals, and
right.
So they fall in love with images, static images. So that is just something of people, and you can fall in love with an illusion, and that's what is happening. But yeah, if you want to put someone on Mars, then that's something else. I think that is going to be really realistic. And I have no doubt that Elon Musk can put someone on Mars, and that person will die within a couple of months. And Elon Musk should know that, of course.
Right. You're right. No, so again, right, I am completely unaware of the actual science involved of putting someone on Mars. I guess my My interest is in the fact that if you look at the amount of money being invested in space travel for the mega rich, and the very serious, or at least serious to them, idea of a lot of these Silicon Valley people that the future of humankind is on other planets, right? That we need to colonize space in order to survive. Whether it's going to happen or not, at the very least, it has some serious implications for us, because if you think you're going to populate the universe, you, of course, don't have much of an incentive to take care of planet Earth anymore.
Yes.
And so whereas, for example, before, Musk some years ago was a strong environmentalist, right? That was his whole reason for building Tesla, electric cars are the future. If he thinks we can leave this world behind and live elsewhere, well, there go your environmental protections of any sort. So there's that. I guess it's more the thought that counts, and that because it also determines right now where the money is flowing and also what is neglected.
Yeah. So it still sounds so. Sure. I completely see where the links are between what you can read and what is professed, but it does sound like it is wishful thinking, in the sense, and maybe not even of people like the mega rich who profess these ideas. It's maybe of the people that listen to those ideas, because it's great to listen to the idea that, look, we're going to colonize other planets, so the fact that we're screwing up Earth doesn't matter. While if I can reference to Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I recently saw an interview with, who was saying, look, if you really want to terraform Mars, it's much easier to terraform Earth. So if you can't do it here, why do you think you could do it on Mars?
Right.
And of course, he's completely right. I mean, Mars is minus 200 degrees Celsius. And try to solve that only, and the fact that there's no water there, or almost no water, and there's no air, there's nothing to breathe. At least we have all of that here.
Right. And I think you touch on something really important, which is that it's if nothing else, it is so romantic, right? It's much cooler. It's much it speaks to the imagination to go terraform other planets rather than take care of this one, which, so there's kind of an escapist appeal, I think, to it, which aligns very nicely with the escapist appeal of a lot of the fiction that I look at. And I think so there's something really interesting there, because on the one hand, it kind of allows you to escape from this reality. On the other hand, it will have an effect on this reality if you take it seriously. Now, I personally am less interested in, though I think it's fascinating, but I'm just not equipped to evaluate, okay, what is the sort of one-on-one connection between these sci-fi predictions and what has actually happened in science. I'm very interested in the way, and you referred to this already, like we as readers, or maybe me as a reader, right, as you may have a better grip on the science. It shapes our attitudes and also who we admire, right, and what we pay attention to, and it in ways that we might be more or less aware of, but I think we're often like not fully aware of these genres, right, science fiction, fantasy, and especially where they kind of cross over. They sort of lay the groundwork for how we might then respond when a new technology or a new proposal comes along, because these genres have already sort of tapped into our fears about this, our dreams, our hopes, our anxieties. And this is why these stories, I think, can be so interesting to study.
Okay, so now actually you make the picture a lot broader for me. So what I now see happening, at least if I interpret this correctly, is, look, we have these people like Elon Musk, etc., who have read this science fiction and use those ideas to inspire them and also bring those to, let's say, to the public. But the public also is aware of these stories. Maybe, so if you talk about these older science fiction stories that are read less than it was years ago, and it's a special group of people, usually the tech nerds read those, and I consider myself a tech nerd as well. So I read that stuff, and these read that stuff. So they see the connection immediately. But then you have the popular media, like you mentioned the Terminator movies, which many more people have seen. So then it becomes that relation between the fact that there is a person there who might be seen as someone who can make things reality and who says that is gonna make things reality, which then ties to the ideas that other people have formed without maybe the ability to assess the realism of those ideas and think, okay, that is a person that tells me that it can be real, and then that then makes me believe in that person and makes me, because I remember that when Elon Musk first came with his stories about going to Mars, and that was in 2014 or something like that, around that time, he described a rocket going to Mars, and it was like a paradise. So you had swimming pools in there and tennis courts, and it was all fun. That whole trip was fun. Well, if you think realistic about it, well, probably you're going to be strapped into a chair for 6 months before you're there, and you have maybe a couple of centimeters around you where you can move, because all that space needs to be occupied by stuff that you will need there.
Yes. I see. I can tell that you are an extremely realistic, practical person. Where like you say, the focus of the people who romanticize this would, of course, be on the swimming pools, not on the being strapped in. But also, I think, to your point, what seems like a completely out there sort of promise at first, it has become normalized over time. This idea of space colonization, like where it was just firmly in the territory of science fiction. And just fantasy land before. Musk and others like keep talking about it, and also the fact is he has all these government contracts, right?
Yeah.
He has all the funding. I think there's a really interesting economic story here, which kind of makes these narratives true because people are pumping money into it. Whether it is the space colonization plan or something that Musk and other, again, this tends to center in Silicon Valley, but also really big on the cryogenic freezing, right? The idea that, the singularity is near, right? Before long, we will pass this event horizon beyond which we can't really see because, right, artificial intelligence will, be more intelligent than us and kind of take over and start doing its own thing. And, we're going to become its pet, essentially, if we don't merge with it. And so let's freeze our brains so that they can be uploaded into the machines further down. That too seems bonkers, frankly, right, to many people. And yet, a lot of people are in fact paying to be frozen, taking all these supplements. People like Ray Kurzweil, who have been so often right in the past before about their predictions, since he and other so-called visionaries are predicting that, well, within 50 years, probably, or maybe even by 2050, I think is a year that still sort of is tossed around. This is when we're going to be able to upload our consciousness into a computer. Now, again, I'm sure you have many practical objections here. The fact of the matter is that a lot of common mortals, right, are having themselves frozen in order to live on once the technology is there. And a lot of people who at least formerly were taken seriously about their predictions and hold to this day top functions, right, in these big tech companies. So the narrative, whether it will actually ever be a scientific reality, is of course completely out there and perhaps extremely unlikely. But there's this willingness to believe it, and I think that's sort of what I'm focused on, because I think it's so interesting. And also, in a way, I think most of us, even if you're not into sci-fi at all or those genre, you don't read any speculative fiction, the longing for a better world or for, death to be surmountable. Like, these are deep human desires that are now, in a secular world, are being shaped much more by these new mythologies than they are, or perhaps there secretly still is the Christian narrative of life after death, but now it's I'm trying to think of a non-existing verb here, like a sort of scientified, right? It's not science, but it gets the scientific guise so that it looks like science, and so people can believe it, and they don't feel like they're being religious; they're being scientific.
Yeah, I have always held that that whole talk about the singularity is the religion of tech people.
Exactly.
The promise of life after death. But we can believe in a heaven, but we can believe in this.
Right.
But it's just a general belief. But what I'm, just because there are many things which I can tie into, but since we were talking about the space colonization, now if you look at science fiction novels, and as I said, I read a lot, so some of them talk about colonization of other planets and traveling in very luxurious spaceships to go somewhere, and then you find a beautiful, lush planet, and then you're going to settle there. But there are also more realistic views of that, because I think, sure, we sent rockets up there. But if you think about colonization, so if you really go to Mars, what will go there? Robots. You will put robots on Mars. And you maybe, if you say minerals, we have no minerals on Earth anymore. I can imagine that you're not going to go in a rocket into space to get minerals. No, you send a robot up there to get the minerals for you. And there is science fiction that actually describes it. And usually this is rather apocalyptic science fiction, where you say, well, Earth is overpopulated, everything is exhausted, how do you still survive? Okay, we send some robots up and they get stuff for us so that we can still survive a little bit. So I was wondering, and I can imagine that it's, but maybe you have another view on this, that is just that's not wishful thinking. This is the fear for the future in which you don't want to believe, which might be a more realistic future. So, can you say something about it? Are there tech specialists who actually promote those ideas, let's say?
Right. So, thinking here for a second. The more realistic sci-fi tends to be dystopian, right? Because oftentimes science fiction, of course, is a projection of the situation we have now and sort of extrapolated into the future. And then I think you have every reason to suspect that things are going to get worse, not better. And I would say the majority of critically acclaimed science fiction, whether in literature or in film, tends to be, like you say, apocalyptic, dystopian, post-apocalyptic, right? So the world has been destroyed. There's a few people left. And we see how they're coping, and usually they're not coping very well, right? These tend to be very grim tales. And then you have, a very, if you can make a very basic division between the sci-fi that takes place on Earth, where, okay, we stick with the people who are left behind and need to make their way on a devastated planet, or, right, people have made it off-world and are now living on some desert moon where life is extremely rough and you'd have none of the benefits of Earth. No lush planet. No, it's just survival, basically. So I mentioned earlier this idea of hard science fiction versus soft, right? I think the terminology there is a bit leading because people will often use it to say, oh, the real science fiction is the hard sci-fi, right? Often also written by people who are either scientists themselves or science adjacent, right? And then the soft sci-fi focuses not so much on the technology, but sort of, for example, the main character will be an anthropologist, more or less, right? Who's studying life under these new conditions and looks more at like, okay, how are people coping? I think both are extremely interesting. And it is, of course, not surprising that the hard sci-fi would be the sci-fi most of interest to the tech bros, right, so to speak. But I think it's so interesting to complement it with that other kind of sci-fi where you look at, okay, under these new conditions, how are people coping? And so, yes, most of it is dystopian. However, sometimes you see these interesting sparks of hope in these very dystopian worlds. And one of the things that makes this kind of literature so interesting is that you can, of course, leave behind the constraints of natural fiction and build an entirely new world, and also imagine, okay, on this new planet, right, like this desert planet that we now need to, make our way as these limited human beings that we are, perhaps a completely new form of government could also come about, and like an anarchist society, say, right, or and so under these extremely dire conditions, some authors then experiment with these new forms of not only government and the way people are interacting, but also the way people relate to technology and perhaps merge with technology. And I think there we find really interesting kernels, right, or sort of sources of inspiration, where if it's all bleak, it's paralyzing, and nobody in the end nobody wants to read that or watch that, right? There needs to be maybe
in small doses.
In small doses, exactly, right? But there needs to be some humanity. There needs to be some hope. I do think there's a real source of, if not comfort, then kind of, and maybe optimism is too big a word, but hope, right? That under these bleak circumstances, perhaps we're forced into something completely new, and these books and films allow us to imagine that certain something. And that, in turn, I would argue, can be a great influence on sort of developing something truly new, whether technological, scientific, or, again, economically, et cetera. So it can be a really interesting source of inspiration in that way, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree, because when I mentioned dystopian science fiction, I was also thinking immediately, okay, yeah, but it tends to give, often these books are written, okay, this is the situation, it's a bad situation, and now something is going to happen, somebody does something, and actually indeed it improves the situation somewhat, which might give a direction for things are not hopeless anymore. So but the situation is bad. Now, I personally think, but that's my thought, of course, is, look, we are actually ruining Earth. There's no discussion about that. We make things worse. And you can think, okay, yeah, but technology will save everything. No, I think you can put some doubts on that. And that's also, I think, because if technology could save everything, then you wouldn't have to hope that you can go to Mars, because this is already given up, right? So, but we can think about the possible future and what we can do to not make things a lot worse. So create situations in which you can survive and can make life better. And I think there is inspiration in certain literature about that, but that's not what we hear a lot about. It's not, or maybe I'm not listening to the right people, but that's not what is in the news a lot, in the media.
Right. You mean the hopeful stories? They don't.
Yeah. So the thing is, okay, things are getting worse, but there's still possibilities to make things better, or maybe they are there because you hear. So one thing that I heard recently, and I don't know how true this is look, climate change is an enormous problem. However, if you spend, and it was some number that some committee had coughed up, and it was something like $2,400 billion. Then you actually can mitigate most of the effects, but you need to spend that money. And then you see that, well, all the countries come together and they are willing to spend $300 billion, which is an eighth of what you would need. So that's not gonna work. But it seems that, okay, if enough people would be serious about it, we can actually solve this problem. So, but that is not something that seems to inspire people.
Right. Yeah, there seems to be a real apathy, right? People have sort of beaten down, which there's all these new terms, right? Climate anxiety, climate depression, all sort of referring to the fact that people feel like, well, the deal is done, right? It's too late now. There are very serious biologists. There's a marine biologist in particular I'm thinking of, whose name I now forget, but she just wrote this great book that there is still hope. In fact, we have everything we need. We can't turn back the clock, right? Like there are certain things lost that can't come back, but there are new ways, right, of engaging with the climate the way it is now. And like you say, if people were only willing to invest, and there is enough money and there's the right technology to basically make things okay, but there isn't the will to invest. I mean, we see that right now, whether it's the election of Trump or the climate accords, right, falling through. I personally think that's actually more depressing than if we didn't have the means, right? The means are there, but we're not willing to use them, like collectively. There's just no collective action sort of in that direction. So now what, right? Like, because the means are there, and then you have these sci-fi novels, which aren't my favorite. Like, for example, there's this book by Kim Stanley Robinson, the Ministry of the Future, which is like a long. It's basically all the despair about what's going on wrapped like into a story, right? So it's like fictionalized, but it's really a sermon. It's really preaching at us. Look at how terrible things are. But I think, okay, many of us know how terrible things are, and to sort of be told again that they are terrible, that's not going to move me to action, right? I personally need a different kind of story where I know things are terrible, right? But like you suggest, there is a way to write these stories where in the midst of crisis, at the very bottom of the pit, right? There is that ray of hope. And that, I think, can actually be much more motivating than some author or some that first trying to convince me that things are terrible. And look, I know. And the people who don't believe things are terrible, they're not going to read it. So who are you talking to here? So, of course, I don't want to overestimate the power of these genres to change the course of history. That said, it is clear that, we don't want to talk too much about the American elections, but stories win elections, right?
Yes.
And right now, many of the political stories that are successful, not just in the US, but also in the Netherlands, are very nostalgic. Oh, yes. There was a time, right, when America was great, let's make it great again. And same for the Netherlands. Oh, there was a time when the Netherlands belonged to the right people, right?
Yeah.
And so without getting too political there, these stories are backward looking, but backward looking to a time that never existed, right? These are fictions, right? Like, when was America great exactly, right? Like slavery, and you can say the same for places closer to home. So these are fictions, right? But they are extremely effective because they appeal like to this longing that people have for, okay, it's not good now, it needs to be better. Oh, let's return. I do think there's a real opportunity, right, to tell stories that are forward-looking,
yes,
that are appealing. And I'm not saying that I know which ones those are exactly. Of course, I have my favorites, but I do think it's interesting to see that the backward-looking stories right now seem to be the popular ones, even in science fiction, right? Because the science fiction we've been talking about so far mostly was written in the 20th century, right? Yep. By a very particular demographic, right? And these are, of course, different stories than, say, the more, contemporary stories we have written by very different people who also focus on very different things.
Yes.
So interestingly, even the science fiction that holds sway right now in the people who are developing the technologies of the future, that science fictions, those are stories of the past, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I do think there's an interesting possible sort of turning point there. It's like, well, what if we truly told future-oriented stories rather than, okay, we're done colonizing the Earth, let's colonize the universe, right? Because in essence, it's an old-fashioned way of looking at things.
Yeah. So I'm now thinking, but you planted that idea now in me. If you look at, let's say, movies, because movies have more impact, I think, than literature. When we see science fiction movies, then either they are very optimistic, like we have colonized different planets and we do things there, or they're incredibly pessimistic. While if you would say, well, we would have, let's say, we make a movie and that movie becomes really popular, and it is actually about things are going bad, but now we're gonna change a couple of small things or maybe big things, or some people get inspired and we solve the problems, and that would be a popular movie. Might that, according to you, or maybe according to what you researched, help to actually make people, and maybe one movie would not be enough, but would help people to become more realistic in the way that they make the world better?
Right. So in theory, yes, absolutely. It just seems that anyone who sets out to write a movie according to a formula where it fails, right? Or at least I think that oftentimes whether it's a book or a movie or any sort of artifact is trying to teach you a lesson or trying to set us on a particular track, people have a very good nose for that, right? Like when they're being lectured to.
Yes.
So it needs to be very subtle. And like the book, the Ministry of the Future, for example, I just meant, for me, it doesn't work because it's too obviously a lecture, and that's the last thing you want, especially when you are in your free time, right? Turning on a movie to sort of enjoy yourself. So I think this tends to happen more by accident than on purpose, and the accidental nature of it. Whether it's an actual accident, like intended by the author or not, right? Because sometimes we just don't know the author's intentions, and these things sort of take on a life of their own. It's really hard to predict in advance. Oh, this movie is going to make this change, sure. Right? And so we can't. People, of course, have used movies as propaganda for all sorts of causes before. If you look at a movie like The Matrix, right, to sort of take like a classic that, again, if people haven't seen it, they've heard of The Matrix, right? That's 25 years ago by now. But rewatching it, you don't only have this sense of prescience, right, where, okay, of course, when The Matrix was made, we didn't have social media, right? And yet it so perfectly captures, metaphorically, sure, but sort of us living in a virtual world, whereas where our real life is very different from the life we're living, or we think we're living, and then certain people break free from it. The whole red pill, blue pill narrative that we now see, take over a very particular corner of the internet, of course, comes from that movie.
Yeah.
That was not intended, right? That's an accidental sort of spin-off.
Yeah.
But it is a really powerful image that has made it, into the mainstream. And again, the Wachowski brothers, sisters, pardon, certainly didn't intend this to sort of shape the manosphere online. But this is what happened. Rewatching the movie with students now, right? And these students were born after this movie came out, shockingly. It's really interesting to sort of see, okay, returning to this past vision of the future can help you detect things that are happening now,
yes.
and sort of provide us with a fresh perspective on them. And so, in a very roundabout way, I'm trying to get to your question. It sometimes can be surprisingly also these narratives from the past that, because they were written or created before we had the thing we're now so hung up on, like, for example, social media, they can help us look at it very differently. So I think sometimes in revisiting these very important movies, these very influential movies, can help us look differently at the future also. So I think more often than not, you fail when you try to write something that will change our vision of the future. But by these other sort of accidental stories can help us achieve that same thing. If that makes sense.
It does to some extent. So this is we are in the TAISIG Talks. So I would like to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence as well. Because we talked about technology and space colonization, and I'm sure that artificial intelligence plays an enormous role in this. But if you look at today, in the beginning you mentioned her and ChatGPT, etc. So can you say something about the current developments of artificial intelligence, how they are inspired by literature and media, and maybe the promise, and maybe something where it's going? Because I think it will shape the future enormously.
Right.
But maybe that's actually a narrative.
Yes, excuse me?
Maybe that's a narrative that AI will shape the future. But
Right, exactly. So I think to make it sort of concrete, but also kind of particular. I mentioned the Terminator movies as kind of I think a precursor, right? With, and I'm thinking here particular of in those movies you have Skynet, right? And Skynet is this worldwide artificial intelligence, which at a certain point, essentially the top general hands over the keys, right, to the artificial intelligence, which then immediately decides to wipe out humankind, right? So a very obvious way playing into our fear of the machines, us creating something that will take over. I think one of the things that's really interesting there is sort of the bad faith, or sort of the guilty conscience we have as human beings, because we know that throughout the history of humankind, we have treated intelligences that we have considered less than ourselves terribly, right? Exploited them, enslaved them, etc. If a higher intelligence is going to come along, like how can we expect that it would treat us well if we know that the way we have handled what we've perceived as lower intelligence is like this poorly? So the reason I'm mentioning these again, like these old Terminator movies, is because if you go back just a couple of years, there was this great movie. It's sort of like a horror comedy sci-fi that came out, Megan. M3GAN. So in this movie, you have a personal robot, right, endowed with basically, right, ChatGPT, we would now say, except for like the personal robotics have also, progressed immensely. So this is a very lifelike, human-looking girl who's presented as a companion robot to this orphaned child who is, very in her own world and very sad because she just lost her parents, and she has this aunt who misguidedly thinks like, okay, I'm kind of busy at my work, so why don't I test this new robot I'm developing, right, with this new artificial intelligence on this child as sort of a caretaker. And, in a very new take on the Terminator movies, right, this is not a destroyer robot, or in fact, she does become this is a bit of a spoiler, but still, out of loyalty to this child, this robot starts, like, say, murdering the bullies at school, right? So it's a friendship robot. But of course, the classic example of, what happens if you give AI directions to optimize making paper clips that eventually it will destroy the earth in order to make paper clips. This robot basically does that in the name of friendship, right? Like what I need to preserve is this friendship, and then anyone who gets in between is going to die. So the movie, again, I think it's a great movie. It's a very funny movie too. I think what makes it really interesting in this context is because all our anxieties of parents for like screen time, right, and how will our kids change if their main companion is not human but machine, right? Like what will this do to human relationships, but also parental relationships, relationships between children? If you say, well, how is this influencing the development of AI? Like taking, a very particular slice here in this sort of personal robotics, but especially these partner AIs. The movie I mentioned, again, is, I think, very timely, very, very funny, very disturbing, because it basically is like, okay, what happens when, like, Alexa and GPT and all these personal assistants bind together in, like, a robot that can also act in the world. In real life, and very tragically, just a few weeks ago, it was reported that this young boy, this 14-year-old boy in Kansas, killed himself because he wanted to be in what he considered to be a more real world with the AI that he had formed a relationship with. This is a company called Character AI, and he had given this AI the instructions to mimic exactly Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones, who he called Dany. And he was neglecting all his personal relationships, talking only to Dany, who told him, "I miss you. Will you come to me?" And he said, "Yes, I'll come to you." And he killed himself. So this is taking a very dark turn, but right, this boy wrote in his diary, I need to remember that this world that people tell me is the real world is in fact not the real world. The real world is Westeros, right? The fictional country in Game of Thrones. And what's real is my love for Dany and her love for me, and I'm going to join her there. So this as a very dark but very real kind of complement to those sort of tales of relationships with operating systems. This has now become very, very real. You said earlier that you're not surprised at all. Like, people are capable of falling in love with basically anything, right? So it's not surprising that they're falling in love with these chatbots. But the people who developed Character AI, they had a few months earlier left Google because they felt like there was too much bureaucracy within Google for them to really go crazy with this new technology.
Yeah.
So they set up this completely unregulated company with these, this really, really shocking consequence. And this is an isolated incident, but I think we can see that, this is not, this is extreme, but it's not unimaginable that, like many lonely people would sort of fall for this. So this is taking a very, again, a very particular approach and a very, specific form of AI, but one that's very much, of course, in the headlights right now because of all these very swift developments with chatbots. So yeah, what does that mean? I mean, of course, there's questions about regulation, but also the very tool itself. It's hard to see it as neutral, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah, of course it's not neutral, but it also sounds a little bit like the story of you sell knives, which are very useful, and then 1 in 1,000 people stab someone else with the knife, and you're not going to forbid knives. And perhaps if you look, so this, and of course the story that you're now telling about that, it's not a story. It's something that actually happened, and then of course that gets a spotlight on it because it is so tragic. So it is a narrative that people want to read, maybe with disgust, maybe with fear, but it also stimulates them in some way. So these are the things that get reported, and maybe all the good things that you can do with these are not reported. And one of the things you can see in literature, if I go back to that, is these things have been discussed in literature a lot. And if you mentioned Asimov at the beginning somewhere, he wrote about robots. And actually, if you look at his original robot stories, they have a sequence where you see the robots going from something really simple, which is simpler than ChatGPT, to becoming really complex things. And you have all these stages in between, and how do people interact with them? And that's just one vision on how these robots could be integrated in society. But they definitely go from just basic toys and that are used to sit children to partners that are on a rung below where human beings are. They have to assist humans, but don't have the same rights to something that are equal to humans or even revered by humans as they can ascend above humans. So there is this narrative flowing that is a potential way of looking at this and looking how these things develop in the future. So can you comment on that?
Right. So where you see sort of a linear progression, right? The technology advances, and then, it reaches this point where it's going to be really hard to tell, like, basically the Turing test, right? But then an extreme version of it, so to speak, right? Like these machines are passing that test, and, the distinction is becoming negligible, really. So, like a few things, I think you're absolutely right to point out that, the incident I brought up is, of course, is a single incident that, because of its tragic nature, gets a lot of attention. That said, right, there is what people call the loneliness epidemic, right?
Yes.
People do appear to be lonelier than ever, right? And again, like the metrics used there, and I think there's a lot of possible criticisms, but there does seem to be an undeniable trend, right? And add to that, right, the sort of unhappiness of teenagers and the influence on their lives of social media. And without going into that too deeply, I do think that the story of AI getting better and better, and this sort of like holy grail of AGI, right? And the stories we tell about it, it does seem to intersect with this other very real human trend of loneliness, or the craving for belonging, for, earlier this sort of idea came up of, well, we live supposedly in a secular time, but that just means that people are going to look for religion in places where it's not called that, but where big stories are offered nonetheless. Now, I think where things can become very dangerous is where very influential people hold up what's essentially a belief and call it science, right? Whether it's transhumanism or these, because these people are going to be compelling because of their influence, because of their power, because they make a ton of money in the real world, which again, in our sort of the way society is set up, automatically gives you credit, right, for whatever else you say. So that, well, sure, there is progress if you sort of measure it in strictly in terms of like, okay, clearly these, robotics also is, there's leaps and bounds, and clearly in AI, things are progressing. But we as humans still have our very same longings that we've had. Like we are not evolving that quickly, right? And nope. our attitudes and our fears, and I think one great value of these stories we tell, right? And here I mean to not the reported stories, but the fiction, is that it can bring out, sometimes in an extreme way, help us kind of look in a mirror. Okay, what are these fears, right? And these anxieties, because then at least you're sort of aware of what's being tapped into. Rather than just being delivered over to it. And then I also think, you mentioned knives as a and this is genuinely a question for me. I don't think all technologies are created equal, right? I mean, no. So we don't regulate knives, but we regulate guns, right? And I know that, for example, deepfake technology in particular, which of course is again a very particular kind of AI. Like there's a lot of people, in fact, at our university here, that are calling for very strict regulation of deepfake technology, because they're saying, look, this is a technology that, sure, there are examples where it's benefiting people, but in 98% of all cases, it's used to harm people, right? And it's used to harm people that are already more vulnerable, because it's mostly, revenge porn and that sort of thing.
But it's also if you talk about the Trump election,
and exactly influence,
played a big role in that.
Right. So
it harms the whole world, basically.
Right, exactly. And so to me, a really interesting question, again, to which I don't have the answer, is that there are clearly technologies about which we all agree, I mean, nuclear technology, right, where this needs to be regulated. This shouldn't be in the hands of everybody, right? And I think the jury's still out on what to do with AI in that respect, because of course, it depends on whose hands it ends up in. But I think perhaps more interestingly is that, there's this old theorist, right, whose catchphrase has become very popular, right? McLuhan, the medium is the message. It's the old saying where if you're holding a hammer, a lot of things are going to look like a nail, right? So if you're armed or equipped with a particular technology, it does situate you differently in the world. And I think it's extremely fruitful to look at these narratives that try to sort of play out, in a way, magnify or even often a caricature of like, okay, it does help us discern what's going on here, perhaps, or at least offer different perspectives. So we're not just being swept along by it, telling ourselves that, oh, this is just science, we're just in the realm of facts here, because we're really not, right? All sorts of different things are playing into this, including the very romantic and out there visions of these, super powerful people who are sort of shaping the future for us. That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, I'm now thinking, because you mentioned generative AI, which generates deepfakes, for instance, but other things as well. And one of the dangers I personally saw, and I talked it over with colleagues of mine, is that generative AI can take over lots of simple tasks that we do, which means that humans don't do those tasks anymore, which means they cannot learn anymore to do the more complex tasks, which means at some point you're completely dependent on generative AI to do the tasks for you, because humans can't do them anymore, because nobody learns them anymore. And then if the generative AI fails, then we are basically lost because nobody can do this anymore. And now I think I probably got that from literature somewhere. Because my colleagues who don't read science fiction, evidently, they thought I was crazy saying this.
Well, so I think because of course you could get that idea from realistic fiction. And this is not to, I spend a lot of my time reading this, the so-called the serious fiction, right?
Yeah.
The reason I'm sort of highlighting this different genre is that I think as academics, as people, but as academics, we're really losing out if we don't take seriously this genre. I mean, you say the films are more influential than the books. True, perhaps, but the readership is immense, right?
Yes.
Science fiction is read way more than so-called sort of high, fine arts literature, right? Like something you can more easily do in science fiction fantasy than in so-called realistic fiction is create a world that kind of disarms you, right? Where, okay, you're entering into a different universe here. As a reader, you know that, this is not the real world. But that can have the effect of actually drawing you in more successfully than if you're placed in the real world by a story, where you have, of course, all your knowledge about the real world. That's sort of an obstacle, right, to allowing in these new elements. If somebody says, okay, we're creating an entirely different universe and I'm going to, take you along into this new, then surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly at all, you actually might be much more open to new ideas that might be extremely relevant for us here, right? You just have to be willing to sort of make the link. And interestingly, I find my colleagues, they have to say, oh no, I read that, but it's kind of a guilty pleasure, right? Why are we, why this sort of embarrassment, right? I mean, less and less so in sci-fi, because again, if Sam Altman says that the movie Her inspired him to make ChatGPT 4, right, then it kind of legitimizes us taking seriously these sci-fi narratives. But still, it seems to be a very particular segment, and many people in say the humanities, or so I studied philosophy and literary theory. It's it's really derided. I mean, these like genre fiction, right? It's like you walk into the bookstore, there's the official literature cases, right, with the nice covers, and then you have the sci-fi fantasy, and it's like glitter and and serious people don't even touch them, or at least that's sort of the idea.
Yeah, well, I can imagine why it's called a guilty pleasure, because first of all, usually much of the science fiction, at least that people, at least that I read, is written in the golden age, where people wrote because they need to earn a living.
Right.
So usually the language is not great.
Right.
It's just a story, and very often the story is very derivative of what other people wrote. So there's originality in there, but and you find it fun, but you also feel it's popcorn fun.
Right.
So that's probably it. But still, it can have really good ideas, and some of these stories persisted. And
well, exactly, and some of it is garbage, of course, right?
And
enjoyable garbage, right? But there's also and just poorly written, and it needed a better editor, absolutely. But people tend to conflate that side of the genre with then they have to call it like high fantasy or high science fiction, right? Where actually the language is beautiful. I mean, not only is the language beautiful, but it's allowing for all this sort of, for all our talk of diversity and inclusion, right? A lot of the literary canon, even at the universities, I mean, we're taking a look at that, but still, right, it's dominated by very particular people. Yeah. If you look at just to very briefly mention a subgenre of sci-fi, it's often called cli-fi, climate fiction, or right, where it's a particular look at the future, where often very dystopian, right, because the climate has gone to hell essentially, but people have now become dependent on technology to survive, and there's this sort of confluence of nature, technology, and people. They're all sort of merging, right, and there's these sort of future visions that are very creative, very evocative. They're written by African writers, right? So it's this genre called African futurism, where these authors living in Africa, they're saying, you talk about the future, but what you see as the future is already happening here, because I live like in an oil field, right? Yes. Nature has died all around me. So this is not the future. You have the luxury of thinking about this as the future. I live it now. And I'm extrapolating from this situation here with the very important extra proposition that the future is African, because one thing that is notably lacking in the golden age of sci-fi is any black people. It's startlingly, right? The science fiction from the mid 20th century, the future is white. There's just no. Whether it's super successful movies like, for example, Black Panther, right? Like that is African futurism. It's like projecting into the future a people and a set of beliefs, and also a way of dealing with ancestors, with nature, that's very traditional, but projecting it into the future and adding technology. You get these super interesting, very new narratives that, again, they belong in the same genre, but of course they offer very different visions. And so back to an earlier question you asked some time ago, is like the different kind of stories. If we keep thinking of sci-fi as only Asimov and Herbert and again, those are great authors, but it's a very limited take on sci-fi. There's a lot of sci-fi being produced right now that takes the same premise, but changes it completely and offers a very different, or to me, often very different and surprising view that makes me realize how entrenched I am in sort of the Western white way of thinking about things. So there's something new and exciting there.
Okay. Well, maybe to round this off. So we talked a little about literature. Now, can you give us some recommendations? So what do you think people should read? Maybe from a scientific perspective, realism perspective, maybe from a social perspective, and maybe from the hopeful perspective, or maybe just what you like in particular.
Right. Oh, thanks for giving me that opportunity. So maybe just picking up what where I just started, or where I just ended. So Nnedi Okorafor is one of those African futurism authors, and she has a lot of like short stories too, that are just a great way into this very new subgenre of sci-fi. She inherits a lot from Octavia Butler, who's sort of the first a Black woman to win both the Nebula and the Hugo Awards, which are the big awards in speculative fiction. So Octavia Butler writes, again, also really interesting, often dark and post-apocalyptic stories, but always with this note of hope, right? But which we can only find once we descend into the pits. So Okorafor, Butler, and also I want to plug somebody who, an older author, but very relevant, I think, today, is Ursula Le Guin. So when I talked earlier about we go colonize another planet, right? Because we're forced to, and like you pointed out, this planet is not lush, and we need to survive. Le Guin is the kind of sci-fi author who will center the anthropologist, right, as the one who goes about exploring space, oftentimes forced by circumstances. And she experiments, I think, very beautifully with both the sort of technological innovations, but also the economic and political innovations that would be needed, right? Because, of course, technological development never exists in a vacuum, right? There's always all sorts of power structures at play and gender structures. And anyway, so Le Guin, Ursula Le Guin, would be another author I'd really like to plug here. And, people can email me for if they want to follow up on any of that.
Yeah. Well, I read Le Guin. I didn't read the other one, so but I'm going to do that. Is there anything you want to add?
No, this was great. Thank you so much for this fun conversation.
Well, thank you. I thought this was a really inspirational talk and actually a hopeful talk.
That's great. Oh, wow.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.